The wind came early that year. It came down from the Beartooth Range like something alive. Not just cold, but deliberate, scraping across the high grasslands of south-central Montana Territory and pressing hard against anything foolish enough to stand in its way. By the first week of November 1878, the settlers along the Stillwater River Valley had already burned through more than a third of their stored cordwood. Old-timers said they hadn't seen frost arrive that thick, that fast, since the terrible winter of 1864. Most people in the valley had cabins. Rough ones, sure. Hen-notch pine logs, mud-chinked walls, low-pitched roofs weighted with sod, but cabins nonetheless. Structures a person could point to and say, "I built that. I'll survive in that." But if you rode east along the valley's edge, past the cottonwood stand near Harlow's Creek, and climbed the long slope of the bluff that overlooked the frozen meadow below, you'd stop. Because rising from the hillside, barely visible against the gray rock face, was a thin ribbon of white smoke. Steady, calm, almost peaceful, and there was no cabin anywhere in sight. No timber frame, no log walls, no chimney sticking up from a roof. Just the bluff, the rock, the dead grass bending in the wind. And that smoke curling up from a crack in the earth like a whispered secret the hill had been keeping all along. Nobody in the valley knew exactly what was happening inside that hillside. Some assumed it was a dying fire left by a trapper passing through. Others figured an animal had somehow carried embers into a den. One man, a freighter named Callum Reese who hauled goods between Billings and the smaller settlements, later told a local recorder that he'd ridden past that bluff 3 times in October and never once thought a living person could be inside. He was wrong. Inside that hillside, a 38-year-old widow named Eleanor Marsh was building something that would outlast every log cabin in the valley and survive a storm that nearly didn't. If this story already has you curious, you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you a real technique from the frontier that actually worked when life depended on it. Drop a comment below and tell us, where are you watching from? Let's see how many countries we can get on this map. Eleanor Marsh had not come west looking for adventure. She'd come because her husband, Silas Marsh, had believed, the way a certain kind of man always believes, that the land just beyond the horizon would finally be the land that gave back what life had taken. They'd left Ohio in the spring of 1874 with 2 mules, a wagon, and enough seed corn to plant 3 acres. By the summer of 1878, Silas was dead. A fever, quick, merciless, unremarkable in the way frontier death usually was. No drama. Just a man there on Monday and gone by Thursday, leaving behind a homestead claim, a half-finished root cellar, a failing cornfield, and Eleanor. Their closest neighbor, a Scotsman named Fergus Dunbar, offered to take her in until spring. She declined, not out of stubbornness or not entirely, but because the homestead claim required continuous occupancy. If she left, she lost the land, and the land was all she had. The cabin, however, was the problem. Silas had started it, but never finished the roof properly. Water had gotten in through the late summer rains and soaked the lower logs. By October, 2 of the corner joists had begun to rot at the base. Eleanor knew enough about building to understand that a structure with compromised corners was a structure that could fail under snow load. She couldn't risk it. She'd been using the cave, a natural limestone alcove cut maybe 18 feet deep into the bluff's face, as a cold storage space since the previous spring. It was the right size for hanging a smoked haunch or keeping seed potatoes from freezing. She'd never thought of it as a place to live. But one evening in early October, while she was inside the cave retrieving a jar of rendered lard, she lit a small fire near the entrance to see by. She stayed longer than she planned, and when she finally stepped back outside into the biting air, she noticed something that stopped her completely. Her face was warm, not just fire warm, stone warm. The limestone wall to her right, the one closest to where the fire had burned, was radiating heat back at her like a hand pressed flat against her cheek. She stood there in the dark for a long moment. Then she went back inside and looked at that wall again. Eleanor Marsh was not an engineer. She had not read books on thermodynamics or studied the heating properties of sedimentary rock. What she had was 40 seasons of watching how heat moved through a house, through a barn, through a cook stove, and the particular sharpness that comes to a person when the alternative to thinking clearly is freezing to death. What she understood from that first accidental fire against the limestone wall was simple. The rock was holding the heat, not just bouncing it back immediately the way a tin reflector would, but absorbing it slowly and releasing it over time. She put her palm against that wall 2 hours after the fire had died down to embers. It was still warm, noticeably, meaningfully warm. She spent the next 3 weeks rebuilding the cave from the inside out. The first thing she did was deepen the fire pit. Rather than burning on the flat cave floor, she dug a shallow depression, roughly 8 inches deep and 2 feet across, and lined it with flat creek stone she hauled up from the Stillwater in a canvas sling 3 or 4 times. This ash pit served 2 purposes. It kept the fire lower, directing heat upward and outward toward the walls rather than straight up toward the cave ceiling, and it contained the coals longer, allowing them to continue radiating after the active flame was gone. Local oral accounts collected by a county recorder in the 1890s describe Eleanor referring to this pit simply as the cradle, a term that, given the circumstances, carries a weight she probably didn't intend. The second modification was the entrance. The cave's natural opening was roughly 5 feet wide and 6 feet tall, large enough to walk through comfortably, and large enough to bleed heat at a catastrophic rate. Eleanor narrowed it. Using flat slabs of shale she pried from the bluff face and a thick mixture of clay, dried grass, and animal fat for mortar, she built a secondary wall inside the original opening, leaving a single low passage, about 2.5 feet wide and 4 feet tall, that forced anyone entering to turn sideways and duck. This was not a design she'd planned. She'd run out of shale before she could complete a full-height doorway, and rather than leave a gap, she finished the wall low and covered the passage with a doubled elk hide hung on a wooden rod. What she'd accidentally created was a thermal buffer, a dead-air chamber between the outside world and the interior. Cold air entering the passage had to travel nearly 3 feet through a narrow, hide-covered corridor before reaching the main space. By the time it arrived, much of its chill had already been absorbed by the stone walls of the passage itself. The third modification was the sleeping platform. She built it 18 inches off the cave floor using stacked flat stones and salvaged planks from the unfinished cabin. Heat rises. She knew this from every winter she'd spent near a wood stove, and the floor of any shelter is always its coldest point. By elevating her sleeping surface, she moved herself into the band of air where the cave's retained warmth naturally collected. On the platform, she laid pine boughs, then a canvas tarp, then 2 wool blankets, and a buffalo robe she'd traded for the previous spring. By late October, the cave was, by any reasonable standard, finished. From the outside, it looked like nothing. A crack in a hill, a dark notch in pale rock, half hidden by the dry brush she'd deliberately left uncut to block the wind. No one riding past would have looked twice. Inside, with the ash pit fire burning at a slow, controlled pace, the temperature held between 52 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius to 14 degrees Celsius, even on nights when the air outside dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 12 degrees Celsius. Not comfortable by modern standards, but survivable. Reliably, consistently survivable. Word travels fast in small communities, and small communities in 1878 Montana Territory were about as small as they come. By early November, Fergus Dunbar had told the Harlow family. The Harlow family had mentioned it at the trading post in Absaroka. And by the time the first real cold snap settled in, the kind that frosted the inside of a log cabin's windows by morning, most of the valley's 30-odd settlers knew that the Marsh widow had given up on her cabin and moved into a hole in the ground. The reactions were, almost uniformly, some version of pity mixed with low-grade amusement. "She's lost her sense," one woman told another, according to later recollections recorded by a church auxiliary in the 1890s. Grief does that. But the remark that seems to have followed Eleanor through that winter, the one she apparently heard repeated more than once, came from a man named Orrin Whitfield. Whitfield was the closest thing the Stillwater Valley had to a professional builder. He'd constructed 4 of the valley's sturdier cabins, had learned timber framing from his father in Vermont, and carried his expertise with the comfortable authority of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything structural. When someone described Eleanor's cave modifications to him at the trading post one afternoon, Whitfield listened without expression. Then he set down his coffee cup, pulled on his coat, and said, with the measured finality of a man delivering a verdict, "Stone holds damp. Damp kills faster than cold. She'll be sick by Christmas and sensible by January." Nobody disagreed with him. He was, after all, Orrin Whitfield. He'd built 4 cabins. What Whitfield understood about limestone was correct in a general sense. Porous rock in a wet environment can harbor moisture and create conditions for illness. What he didn't account for was the specific geology of that particular bluff. The limestone there was dense, low porosity, and elevated well above the valley's water table. The cave's interior, according to oral accounts from Eleanor herself, stayed noticeably dry throughout the winter. Drier, she claimed, than the interior of Silas's half-finished log cabin had ever been, with its gaps and its rotting corners and its tendency to breathe in whatever weather happened to be passing by. But no one in the valley had measured Eleanor's cave. They had only looked at it from the outside, and from the outside, it still looked like a hole in a hill. The blizzard arrived on the night of January 14th, 1879. It had been building for 3 days, a pressure system pulling cold air down from Canada in a long, slow exhale that dropped temperatures across the territory by nearly 30 degrees in less than 48 hours. By the morning of the 14th, the sky over the Beartooth Range had gone the particular shade of flat gray that experienced Montana settlers recognized not as a color, but as a warning. By nightfall, the snow was horizontal. Wind speeds later estimated at between 40 and 55 miles per hour drove the storm across the valley floor, piling drifts against south-facing walls, collapsing the Harlow family's woodshed roof under a load of wet snow that built up too fast to shovel off, and driving the temperature at ground level to somewhere between minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius to minus 30 degrees Celsius by midnight. These were not record-breaking numbers for Montana, but they were sustained. The storm didn't pass in a single violent night. It sat over the valley for 4 days. Inside the log cabins of the Stillwater Valley, the reality of those 4 days was brutal in a very specific way. The problem wasn't the cold itself. Most of the settlers had enough wood to keep a fire going. The problem was consumption. A standard frontier fireplace, burning green or partially seasoned pine in that kind of wind and temperature, draws air through every gap in the cabin walls, creating a draft that pulls heat up the chimney almost as fast as the fire can produce it. Orrin Whitfield's own cabin, well-built, properly chinked, went through nearly 2 full cords of wood in those 4 days. He later told Fergus Dunbar that by the morning of the 17th, he'd begun rationing, feeding the fire just enough to keep the temperature inside above 28 degrees Fahrenheit minus 2 degrees Celsius. His water barrel froze overnight on 2 separate occasions. At the Harlow place, with the woodshed collapsed and the remaining cordwood buried under 3 feet of compacted snow, the family spent 1 full night huddled in the space directly in front of the fireplace, taking shifts to keep the fire alive, feeding it furniture when the wood ran short. And on the bluff above Harlow's Creek, in the crack in a hill that nobody had taken seriously, Eleanor Marsh fed her ash pit fire once in the morning and once in the evening. That was it, twice a day. She burned, by her own later account, roughly 1/3 of a cord of wood across the entire 4-day storm. Small, dense pieces, slow burning. The limestone walls had been absorbing heat for 3 months by then, and they gave it back with a patience that no fireplace and no log wall could match. The cave's interior, measured with a small mercury thermometer she'd salvaged from Silas's surveying kit, never dropped below 44 degrees Fahrenheit 6.7 degrees Celsius. Not once. Not even on the second night, when the wind outside hit its recorded peak and the temperature outside fell to its lowest point. 44 degrees, in a hole in the ground, while the rest of the valley burned furniture to stay above freezing. Stay with me, because what happened when the storm cleared is the part that changed everything. The number that came out of that cave silenced every person in the valley who had laughed. Subscribe right now. Every week, a real technique from people who survived when survival wasn't optional. And drop a comment. Where are you watching this from? I want to know. The storm broke on the morning of January 18th, 1879. The sky cleared the way Montana skies always do after a true blizzard. Suddenly, completely, almost insultingly bright, as if the previous 4 days had been a private matter the weather was no longer willing to discuss. The cold remained. If anything, the clearing brought a sharper, drier cold than the storm itself. Still air at minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius. The kind that turns breath to crystals before it leaves your lips and makes the snow creak underfoot like old floorboards. The valley's settlers emerge from their cabins in the slow, blinking way of people who have spent 4 days rationing everything: wood, food, sleep, warmth, and are not yet certain the ordeal is over. Roofs were checked. Animals were dug out of drifts. The Harlow family's woodshed was assessed with the grim silence of people counting a loss they couldn't afford. Fergus Dunbar was the first to climb the bluff. He told the story himself, years later, to anyone willing to listen, and his account was consistent enough across retellings that a county historian noted it in an 1897 regional record. He'd gone up, he said, half expecting to find Eleanor in some state of distress, hypothermic, sick, in need of rescue, confirming everything Orrin Whitfield had predicted. He'd brought a wool blanket over his shoulder and a flask of whiskey in his coat pocket, the frontier version of an ambulance kit. He knocked on the elk-hide door. Eleanor opened it. She was dressed. She had color in her face. There was a small fire burning in the ash pit, barely larger than what you'd use to heat a pot of coffee. The cave smelled of pine smoke and dried herbs, and something warm and mineral, the smell of hot stone, though Dunbar apparently didn't have the words for it at the time. He stepped inside, pulled off his glove, pressed his bare hand flat against the limestone wall to his left. It was like touching a stove that had been banked for the night, he said. Not hot, but holding. He checked her thermometer. The interior of the cave read 46 degrees Fahrenheit, 7.8 degrees Celsius. Outside, at that same moment, the air temperature on the exposed bluff face was minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius. The difference between those two numbers, 60 Fahrenheit degrees, 33 degrees Celsius, of separation, with no furnace, no insulation bats, no manufactured material of any kind, was produced entirely by 3 things: the thermal mass of the limestone walls, the geometry of the entrance passage, and the ash pit fire Eleanor had fed twice a day with split, dry pine cut to fist-sized pieces. Now, consider what was happening in the valley below. Orrin Whitfield's cabin, built by a trained craftsman, properly chinked, with a full stone fireplace, had averaged an interior temperature of between 29 degrees Fahrenheit and 35 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius, during the storm's worst nights, despite burning wood at a rate Whitfield later estimated at close to 2 full cord for the 4-day period. His fireplace, like most frontier fireplaces of the era, was a radiant heater by design. It warmed the air and the people immediately in front of it, but also drew cold outside air in through every gap in the cabin envelope to feed its combustion, creating a constant thermal drain that the fire had to work against continuously. Eleanor's system worked differently. The ash pit's small, slow fire didn't need to heat the air from scratch every hour. The limestone had already done that work, storing heat absorbed over weeks and releasing it in a long, steady exhale. Each time Eleanor fed the fire, she was essentially topping off a battery, not building from zero. The wood consumption numbers were, by any measure, striking. Eleanor had burned an estimated 0.3 cords of wood across the entire 4-day storm. Whitfield burned nearly 2 full cords. The Harlow family, factoring in the furniture they'd fed to the fire on their worst night, consumed an equivalent of roughly 1.6 to 1.8 cords. For settlers who had spent the summer and fall hauling, splitting, and stacking wood, who measured cordwood the way others measured money, these were not abstract statistics. They were the difference between having reserves and having nothing. Eleanor had reserves. She had, in fact, not come close to the edge of her wood supply at any point during the storm. Dunbar stood in that cave for nearly 20 minutes, pressing his hand against the walls, reading the thermometer twice, looking at the small stack of remaining split pine near the entrance. Then he picked up his blanket, tucked his whiskey flask back in his pocket, and walked back down the bluff without saying much. But he was thinking. Anyone watching his face on that walk down could see it, the specific expression of a man revising something he had believed to be settled. Spring in the Stillwater Valley in 1879 came the way it always did, grudgingly, in fits and starts, with late snows in March and mud so deep in April that wagons sank to their axles on the main track between homesteads. But by May, when the cottonwoods along the creek started showing green and the settlers began the long work of assessing winter damage and planning the next season, something had shifted in the way people talked about Eleanor Marsh. It started with questions. Fergus Dunbar was the first to ask, directly, formally, hat in hand, if Eleanor would show him the ash pit. She did. He crouched in the cave for an hour, pressing his palms against the walls, studying the entrance passage, asking about the creek stones she'd used to line the pit, and how she'd mixed the clay mortar for the shale entrance wall. He left without committing to anything. But that summer, when he rebuilt the cold end of his barn, he lined the north interior wall with a double course of flat fieldstone, floor to ceiling. He never explained his reasoning to anyone. He didn't need to. The Harlow family's eldest son, a practical young man named Court Harlow, came next. He spent an afternoon with Eleanor in early June, sketching rough dimensions in a small notebook. That fall, when he dug out an expanded root cellar behind the family's cabin, he incorporated a narrow entrance passage. Not a full thermal buffer, but a single right-angle turn that broke the direct line of cold air into the cellar's interior. Local accounts from later years note that the Harlow root cellar became one of the most reliable cold storage structures in the valley, maintaining temperatures between 34 degrees Fahrenheit and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius, through even the hardest winters. Orrin Whitfield came last. He came in July, alone, on a weekday morning when most of the valley was busy with haying, and Eleanor later told Dunbar that he'd stood in the entrance of the cave for a long time without speaking. He brought no notebook. He asked no questions about dimensions or materials. He simply looked at the ash pit, at the entrance passage, at the dark limestone walls that still held a faint warmth even in midsummer, when no fire had burned in them for weeks. Before he left, he said one thing. "The rock does the work," he said. "The fire just reminds it to." It was, in its way, the most precise description of thermal mass heating that anyone in the valley had managed to produce, and it came from a man who had predicted Eleanor would be sick by Christmas. By the winter of 1880, 5 structures in the Stillwater Valley incorporated some version of what Eleanor had built: stone-lined walls and root cellars, narrow entrance passages and storage sheds, ash pit fire management, and at least 2 homestead cabins where the owners had modified their existing fireplaces to burn lower and slower. None of them were caves. None were exact copies. But all of them carried the same core understanding. That stone, given enough time and a patient fire, becomes a heating system in its own right. By the winter of 1881, the county recorder in Columbus noted, in a brief and characteristically dry administrative entry, that several settlers along the upper Stillwater had taken to referring to stone-lined wall construction as the Marsh method. The recorder did not elaborate. He didn't seem to think it required elaboration. Eleanor herself stayed on the homestead. She proved up the land claim in 1882, as required under the Homestead Act, 5 years of continuous occupancy and demonstrated improvement of the land. The cave was listed in her improvement documentation as a permanent thermal dwelling with stone-mortared entrance, ash pit hearth, and elevated sleeping platform. The land office accepted it. She was still there in 1885, according to tax records. Still on the bluff. Still, as far as anyone could tell, warm. There's a version of Eleanor Marsh's story that gets told as a tale of stubbornness. A woman too proud to accept help, too attached to a piece of land to make the sensible choice, surviving by accident what she was too inexperienced to plan. That version is wrong, and it's worth saying so plainly. What Eleanor did in the fall of 1878 was not accidental in any meaningful sense. The accident was the first fire against the limestone wall. Everything after that was observation, reasoning, and work. She identified a physical property, thermal mass, the capacity of dense material to absorb and slowly release heat, and she built around it with the material she had, in the time she had, under conditions that left no margin for error. The limestone walls of her cave held heat because limestone has a volumetric heat capacity of roughly 500 to 600 BTU per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit. An 18-foot deep cave lined with walls averaging 14 inches thick contains, conservatively, several tons of stone, and several tons of stone, brought to temperature over weeks of patient firing, becomes a thermal battery that no single night of cold can fully discharge. The fire doesn't heat the air. The fire heats the stone. The stone heats the air. And when the fire dies, the stone keeps working for hours, sometimes for most of a day. This is not a secret. The principle is the same one used in the Russian masonry stove, the Finnish contraflow heater, the Rumford fireplace, and the adobe walls of the American Southwest, where 18-inch thick earthen walls have been regulating interior temperatures for centuries before European contact. The physics doesn't change. What changes is whether the people building shelters understand the physics well enough to use it. Eleanor Marsh understood it because she paid attention to what the rock was doing. Not because she had read about it. Not because someone taught her. Because she was cold and she needed to think clearly, and she did. That gap between what the stone was doing and what the settlers assumed it was doing is the gap that Orrin Whitfield fell into. He knew timber. He knew that wood frame construction, properly chinked, would stop wind. He was right about that. What he didn't know, or didn't think to apply, was that stopping wind and storing heat are two different problems, and that solving one doesn't solve the other. Eleanor solved both. With limestone, creek stones, shale slabs, clay, animal fat, elk hide, and salvage planks. The frontier produced this kind of engineering constantly, in every region where people had to survive winters without manufactured materials. The Alutiiq people of coastal Alaska built their barabaras, semi-subterranean sod, and driftwood structures on the same thermal mass principle, using the earth itself as insulation and the body heat of the people inside as a supplemental heat source. The Plains peoples who wintered in earth lodges understood that a structure built into the ground and covered with several feet of sod could maintain interior temperatures 30 to 40 degrees warmer than a surface-level shelter in the same conditions. The sodbusters of the Kansas and Nebraska plains, who are often remembered as building sod houses out of desperation, were in many cases building structures with walls that outperformed timber frame construction in thermal retention by a significant margin. The pattern is consistent across cultures, climates, and centuries. The people who survived the worst winters were not usually the people with the most wood. They were the people who understood how to make heat stay. Eleanor Marsh was one of those people. She didn't set out to teach anyone anything. She set out to not freeze. And in not freezing, with a third of the wood, in a cave on a bluff that everyone in the valley had dismissed, she left behind something that mattered more than most of the formal structures built that decade. Proof that the old knowledge works when the people who carry it are willing to trust it. The smoke is still rising from the hillside, in a manner of speaking. It always has been. We just stopped looking. And that's the story of Eleanor Marsh and the cave that outlasted the blizzard of 1879. If you made it this far, you already think differently than most people. That's exactly who this channel is for. Hit subscribe, because every week we go back into the record and pull out one more technique that worked when everything else failed. These aren't theories. These are solutions that were built under pressure, in the cold, by people who couldn't afford to be wrong. And leave a comment below. I want to know two things. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever lived through? I read every single one. See you next week. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional. while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.